My name is Mark Seaton, as you guys mentioned earlier. Flew out from Chicago, came in to help out. Started as just loaning the subwoofers, as we talked about. I want to make sure that we can get them set up and working properly, show off properly, and weather here in California is a lot better than Chicago. So with that, it turned into, if I'm going to come out, why don't we do something of a talk of something that might be of interest, which is actually setting up the home theater system to get the most from the sound. The setup is probably one of the most critical aspects for audio. The speaker gear, especially once you get past a certain threshold, really your limit becomes not how good the product is, but how well you are getting what the product does to your listening position. And so our end goal is really getting all the things we spend all that time designing. Mainly the performance behind a big subwoofer with, two 15-inch woofers and 2,000 watts inside it. While that sub will, in most rooms will have extension down to 10 hertz, outdoors down to 19. When you put that in your room, the first thing you encounter is all the interactions with the walls and everything else, and it comes down to, are you actually realizing that at your seat? The subwoofers are fun to talk about because it's the most obvious, but really the entire system benefits from this a lot. I ended up, when we first started my business, I picked off a niche of the guys early on building big dedicated home theaters. At the time, a lot of guys were taking cute little paradigms and PSP bookshelves and trying to fill 20 by 30 theaters with 3 rows and behind a perforated screen. They turn things up and wonder why it falls apart when they do. Then people went on to studio monitors and other pro gear trying to find a blend. I spent some time in the pro market, saw what high output could do if it, and then if you polished it enough, and that's what I've come to do here, is deliver the output and the clean dynamics, and that's really what it's about. It's not about going deaf. It's about never running out before, and the speaker's not running out before you do. And with that, our products are physically much larger than what was available at the time. We've been doing this now 10 years, and through that have really seen the rest of the market scale up to start realizing that we have some big rooms that we end up filling. I have a couple customers who have home theaters that aren't a whole lot smaller than this room. And they're fun rooms. Not everybody has that, and the fun thing is that audio scales very well. So scaling this down to a 13 by 17 typical living room works just as well, and all the things we talk about work in that. The first what really boils down to is making sure that the sound is getting to your listening position, and that you're aiming the speakers and all the equipment, placing it where it will work. So while Odyssey and all the room correction systems promise that you press a button and automatically make everything sound great, they only work with what you give it. And so whatever hits that microphone is what it gets to work with. And they have to make all kinds of assumptions that things are aimed right, working right, or they have to account for as many things that could go wrong as they can possibly plan for. So by far the biggest aspect, especially once you're getting into a full surround sound system, is when before you go and try and calibrate anything, generally when we do a big room, we'll start by running pink noise right through every speaker, not the test tones, and you can start with the test tones in the receiver, but the best bet is either one of the test discs, like one of the Spears Munsell ones has audio, I thought it has the audio calibration. The second one has all the audio calibration on it, and there's a few others out there. There's also products, free software out there called Room EQ Wizard and some others that'll let you route sound over an HDMI connector right to every channel you want. When you can do that, you can isolate one speaker, like a surround speaker, and make sure that when you have your rows, the main sound isn't 3 feet above your head. And sometimes just that little bit of aiming can be the difference of getting kind of, what's the big deal, to, hey, this is working great. even in here, with the speakers, when I was setting this up, the first 2 rows would sound quite good. And as you get to the back, actually a lot of the main sound load that sounds like the front rows actually is up about a foot or 2. And so the tall guys in the back rows will get a little better sound than the shorter ones. When we get into a theater with multiple rows, as soon as you get 2 rows, then you actually really want to figure that out. And often you have to kind of aim in between or pick which seat needs to get the most attention. And the key there is start by getting your ear accustomed to what it should sound like. And when you put pink noise through the one speaker, you'll hear the shh sound it should make. If you stand up in front of it on the level of the tweeter, that's generally, about 3 feet away or so, that's generally the direct sound that the speaker makes, not too much from the room. Now go back out to the listening position, move around up and down, see what happens when you angle things. Sometimes you'll find that one sounds completely different than another, and often that's just because of where the walls are. Symmetry is your friend when you can do it. Often it's actually useful to pull out the tape measure and actually measure, are the 2 speakers the same distance from the front wall? How well can you center it on the screen versus the boundaries of the room? As you get into if you're doing a lot of stereo listening, then that symmetry left to right makes even more difference. And in fact, to get the best sound at that main money seat, you'll want to take a tape measure from top front of the speaker out to where the projector is and see if the 2 are there. If you play just pink noise or a burst signal through 2 speakers and try and just subjectively find the middle, they've consistently found listeners can actually locate themselves between 1/4 and 1/2 inch accuracy, and that's just by ear. So when it's easy when you're doing this, but as soon as one speaker is further from you, you're then kind of fighting to get that. And Odyssey will try and do that, but it takes one ping, and it goes from where that exact microphone tip is. We have 2 ears. Things get averaged out, so there's a lot to be said for getting it right to start. The same thing with the surround speakers, making sure that like we were saying, that it's not aimed over your head. The same thing can happen if you have a speaker placed, before you mount it, have a friend hold it up there and sit down at the seats and listen, move across the seats. And sometimes moving it up a couple feet will keep from barreling onto the close listener, and moving it up you get just a little off axis and it's not so hot there. The far listener gets more of the sound and you get more evenness throughout the room. So as we then get in, once we have all the speakers located, then you can get into looking at the subwoofers. The subwoofers, there's a few ways to get there. You can go by rules of thumb. There's a lot of papers out there. Many have seen what Harman has put out over the years. There's been 3 or 4 papers they've done with different methodologies and that. The problem with all of that comes down to the fact that most rooms in our home, unless they're a bunker and a perfectly structurally symmetrical bunker, are all a little irregular. And ultimately, the only thing that is 100% certain is pulling out a microphone. And the great thing nowadays is we have companies like Mini DSP. Parts Express sells something similar as well. But this product from Mini DSP, this is a microphone, preamp everything contained. There's a mini USB connector on the back. It comes with about a 10-foot cord, and you can even buy 15-foot extensions. And this $75 calibrated microphone works with free Room EQ Wizard software that can be downloaded online, and you can precisely see what is getting from the sub to your listening position. So while we can do a lot of placement and general rules of thumb of, it's important to know where to start with the sub, probably the most important to recognize is what your walls really look like to a subwoofer. The most common problem we run into are, for those of us in the Midwest and elsewhere with basements, We have rooms where we have or even near an external wall, you have a brick or a foundation wall on one side, and the other wall of the room happens to be your utility room or rest of the house. And while the drywall inside that shoebox-shaped room looks symmetrical, what's really going on for below 100 hertz is that the drywall and 2x4s is largely transparent, and then the brick or concrete or foundation wall is a perfect mirror. So while what visually looks symmetrical actually is not. And in large rooms or in asymmetrical rooms like that, the first spot you should be trying to put the subwoofer is in actually the most solid corner of the room. So where you have two exterior walls. In a big open room, that's always the best spot to start, is by the opposite any big openings into the rest of the house, so the kitchen off to the dining room and everything else, that opposite corner. If you have the brick wall or exterior wall with the fireplace there, it's usually that solid wall that isn't the full bay windows and everything. And reliably, you'll see that you get more even response across the room. The difference, to put some perspective on what the placement of the subwoofer does in the room, after we're done, I took some measurements in here in a couple different locations, and just to kind of see what some of these adjustments of what it really looks like. And this is another odd room, and that behind this are kind of windows or a soft wall. So these are not comparative. These are kind of asymmetrical walls in here too. With that, when you put that in perspective of upgrading your subwoofers, this is where it gets really confusing and mind-boggling of how significant the effect is. And that is that when you go from a single subwoofer and you put two in your room, going from 1 to 2, driven the same levels, if you just plug 2 in with the same exact settings, ideally, at least down low, you're generally going to get 6 dB in an increase in sound across most of the bandwidth, especially down low. So to get 6 dB more output, you're generally spending twice as much. We do have the ability here, it's half as much. But what we're talking about in peaks and dips in your room are regularly plus peak to valley of 10 dB, sometimes as much as 20. So simply moving a subwoofer from one corner to the other can often have a 6 to 10 dB difference in some of the ranges that are the most important, where if you ever found yourself chasing the volume control, where on one movie it's too hot, one movie it's way too quiet. Usually what that is the one bit of material has something in an upper bass range that punch you in the chest, and maybe that's not there. You turn it up to try and get that. Then another movie comes in that has a lot of deep bass material, and because you've just turned it up to try and get that range, now the rest of the range is way out of whack and too boomy, muddy, and overbears everything. So the irony is that at first glance, smoothing out and getting a better location for the sub will seem like it might even be a little bit quieter than if you have a huge peak and boominess in the room. But once you get the system balanced out, you're actually getting more information because you're not missing all those gaps. And in some movies, something will be happening and you'll lose some strong effect going on in a scene that someone with the system dialed in won't be there. So in general, when you get the bass smooth and delivered to the listening position, you actually get more detail and more overall energy because you're not missing out on parts of it, or one bit of it isn't sticking out and overdoing everything. As far as the subwoofers, the tricky thing, everybody talks about using multiple subs. So when you're using multiple subwoofers, let's face it, a big part of this comes down to where can you place it. So often it is a matter of taking the microphone, putting it out there, taking your subwoofer, put it on furniture sliders or carpet or a towel, slide it around. Don't touch the volume control at all. Set it so you get your reading. We'll go through some of that later. But the idea is you take your subwoofer so it's producing the same sound all the time. You start say in the corner, move it to, take a measurement, move it to the middle, move it to the other corner. And in that, you'll actually see that some of those curves are actually louder than the other. And your subwoofer is producing the same energy. It's just a matter of how much is actually getting to the listening position. And in most rooms, like we said, finding that solid corner is the first start. Many are relegated to placing the subwoofers at the front wall. And when you're doing so, doing a symmetrical left to right placement, whether it's two flanking a center channel or all the way out at the corners. Quarter points on the front wall also work very well. They all have little different benefits of that. Generally what you're doing is you're reducing some of the variations left to right. And with that you're making it more consistent as you go across the couch so that the one on the right doesn't get a hot spot and the one on the left doesn't wonder what's going on. So now you even that out in that way. One nice thing is that if you do only have one row of seats, you can often get lucky and either in moving the seats fore and aft a little bit and with the subwoofers in the room, you can sometimes get a full couch worth just from a front wall subwoofer placement. And where things get very tricky is when you get to multiple rows. And the other aspect is when we can adjust with the width of the subs for what's going on in the width of the room, but one of the most dominant problems in a room is the length. The length is going to be based on where you're sitting front to back in the room, where the subwoofer is. Most often your subwoofer is at the front, at the same front to back spot as your speakers. In that case, your speakers and your subwoofers are going to share the exact same problem, which usually comes in the form of a big suck out in some spot. There'll be a peak followed around that, but can be a big hole. The most annoying of those that so many deal with are when there's a big hole right around about 60 to 80 hertz, because that, contrary to what some think of what the low frequencies do, when it comes to a big kick drum or anything that explodes and impacts you, it's actually the whole upper half of the subwoofer range, 50 to 100, that is that kick in your chest. And when you talk about what kind of aspects, I'm looking at a graph and I see all these frequencies and this squiggly line. What does that actually mean? Again, we'll go through that on some graphs later. But it kind of does subjectively go from head to toe. And the 75 hertz range, you're feeling that kick in your chest. As it gets down to the 45 to 35, that's kind of the rumble in the belly. And when you get down into the 25 hertz range, that's the pant legs flapping. And it is really that simple. But it is that useful if you're paying attention and listening. What that does is that helps you later of, okay, now I've got it roughly flat. What do I turn it up more? What am I trying to get? So when we do get those big holes in the response from everything being up front, the best solution is to get another subwoofer towards the back half of the room. And sometimes you can, and then this is where it comes into where can you place them in the room. If you have a blank slate, something like we're doing here is a good approach. I would probably push these, we're off the front wall and off from the back wall because of limitations of the big space and cording it off with the drapes, but starting at the front wall and then taking the rear subwoofers at the corners and then testing them at the corners or moving them a quarter point forward. Generally, you can, when you go to move subwoofers, you don't have to worry about moving every 2 inches. Subwoofer wavelengths generally are in the 10 feet up range. And you generally can start at about 4 foot increments and then get it down to about 2. Once you get down to 2, if you're happy with how everything is, you can play around with finer bits there. But a grid of 2 feet, you're going to have a hard time hearing a significant difference there until you've got everything balanced out. So it's not moving every couple inches. It's usually the testing along the wall is corners, middle, quarter point, maybe thirds, and that relates to the standing waves that have. That the idea is the person sitting in the middle can get stuck in a big peak or a big trough, or the ones at the quarter points can have similar issues. with the rear subwoofers, unfortunately, the auto correction systems, as much as they've tried to do good results with that, they're kind of hit or miss. Sometimes Odyssey with the two subwoofers will work well, sometimes it won't. The absolute best is to take out the microphone. If you take out the microphone, the nice part is that in our processors now we have delay settings, and some of the subwoofers on the market, the new version of ours and a couple of competitors also now even have a knob on there to add delay to the sub, which is kind of a replacement for what used to be your phase control. Phase control is kind of holdover from the audiophile 2-channel world, and what happens, the old phase controls end up changing the entire frequency range, where usually we're just trying to fix all the parts in the upper half that are where the two subs are fighting each other. When it gets down to 20 hertz, the wavelength is, what is as long as this room. So at that point, they're all working together at that point. Where we're trying to fix things is usually above 35 to 45 hertz, and that delay gives you a fine adjustment that predominantly works at the upper end. And you'll find, I have a couple things there. I did an adjustment of about 10 feet total, and you can see all the interaction of the subs move when the subwoofers are producing the exact same energy. So your subwoofer, we take subs that are working just as well, just as hard, but by simply making adjustments to the settings, you're changing the system to be 3, 6, even 15 dB more efficient over some ranges. This can go on into something, of course we can go on all day of showing examples in that. So I'm trying to just give a general overview of what you need to be looking for. But reliably in the big dedicated home theaters, what we're doing are 1 to 2 subwoofers on the front wall, 1 to 2 units on the rear, often even finding ways to conceal them. The other bit we're announcing very soon is we've taken this, our submersive, cut it in half by volume, so it's just a single 15-inch, and packed that into a subwoofer with the exact same 10 hertz extension in room, but only 11 inches deep. And with that, we can now tuck it behind things in a corner, stack a couple up. By doing that, you can't get around the laws of physics and needing the box size, so it is 16 by 30. But we can then power 4 of those, just like we can power 2 of these boxes with one of our big amplifiers. So there's all kinds of ways you can get creative with getting that bass at the front of the room, back of the room. Generally, and reliably, the best results I've always gotten have been to, as a whole, blend the subwoofers in front, blend the subwoofers with the subwoofers in rear, treat it as an entire system, one big subwoofer. Everybody talks about a lot of people talk about, well, but I want my stereo bass, this and that. And really, there isn't much stereo bass recorded. The stuff that is, usually there's so much cues related to that in the main speakers that they still give you those spatial cues. There's some cases when you get near acoustically perfect rooms and extremely large rooms that you can experiment with getting stereo bass. I'd encourage everyone to first get the bass delivered to the seats, as most of those systems I've investigated fall well short of that goal. And so the goal is, generally the process is, front subs, find a placement that delivers it with minimal dips to the seats. Rear subs that the dips don't coincide. So if the front subwoofers have a dip at 40 hertz, you want the rear subs not to have a coinciding dip. And that's, I found one spot in here where they did have that coinciding dip, and you'll see that in the measurements. So that's something I would have moved the rear subwoofers further to try and get. So the idea is that where one has a weakness, you want the other to pick up. And by driving, we actually drive them equally. Odyssey, one of the biggest faults it does at the start is it asks you to level match the two subs. They do that because most people won't match them if you don't tell them to, and they know that some people have different subs, front and rear. ideally, when you have the same subwoofers front and rear, drive them equally, then one doesn't run out of gas before the other. When you have different subwoofers, what you end up wanting to do is do a lot of experimenting, put some soundtrack in you like, and keep turning them up and try and get it so that one that you can use all of the stronger sub and the weaker one isn't limiting the system. So, or at least not within the range you want to listen to. So once you get all of that blended together, now you go back, calibrate the whole system, get everything together. Once you get everything aligned, placed, and all that, then you can get into working with all the different room correction systems. The room correction systems out there, Odyssey is by far the most visible and the most prominent. Works very well for a point-and-shoot system. The biggest failings really come in to what we talked about, where are the speakers in a good spot to begin with. You can actually see if you've missed something often, if you've gone through that whole long process of waiting for Odyssey to run through everything, and at the end, you see some big discrepancies of one channel being 6 dB higher, your right channel 6 dB higher than your left. There's a good chance that something was wrong, aiming, connection, whatever. Watch for big distance settings that don't make sense. Sometimes something's flipped in polarity, or there's a piece nearby that's reflecting actually stronger than the sound direct from the speaker. So with all the systems, the most important thing is the information the system gets. So that is the microphone placement. And the by far the biggest advantage you can have with any of these is to invest the $25 to $50 in, actually, Dave, can you grab my mic stand there that behind you? Yeah. Yeah. And of course, booby traps. This one is a German-made, more expensive one. I believe it still was all of $45 or $65 with all the pieces. They have ones at Parts Express and others for as little as $25, sometimes at Guitar Center. The most important one for setting up a home theater, most of them come out about that tall. The key is to make sure you get one with what they call this a boom arm. And this allows you to get out from the post. And the reason for that is if you get the little puck, and in fact we have one of those, don't we? Can you pull that one out?
Is it over here somewhere?
Yeah, between the two amp and Marantz. When you get the little microphones that it comes with, this one might be on a little tripod, I think. So you get your little Odyssey box with the microphone in here. And the microphones work fine, but the biggest downfall is that you're stuck using the little bit. And in fact, this is one of the newer ones. Some of the old ones come with a flat puck, and you basically set that on the seat back. So immediately now you're limited to hoping that your ears are the same height as where your seat back is. And you can't move the microphone forward, back, around, all those things. This one actually has a threaded insert on the bottom, so you can mount it. Most cameras, tripods would mount this. There are some adapters you can get for this. Generally what I take is some blue painter's tape. Put usually these come with a clip, and you simply tape it to the end of the mic. The benefit now is we go over to a seat, and we can actually get right where your ear height is. And what happens with room correction is that it tries to correct everything. And you'll notice that all of them ask for multiple measurements. The reason they do that is they're trying to average out all those measurements so that they figure out a little bit of what is coming from the room, what is in the speaker, and what shouldn't be fixed. And really that last bit of what shouldn't be fixed is the key to getting good sound. The earliest room correction systems were critiqued for making it sound overly processed or leave you with a head in a vice type of situation where you move 6 inches this way or that and the sound completely changes on you. The way to get around that is that, sometimes they'll tell you to make the big, across the couch and all over the room. If you know you're mostly listening in the middle of the couch and you've aimed the speakers well, some of the best results come from just creating a bubble around your listening position. And usually that comes from, if where I'm sitting is the head position, is one, the first measurement on almost all the systems needs to be dead center between the left and right, and on the center, and at your ear height. Reason being, that first measurement they take is the one that they figure all the distances from. So they figure all the distances from that first measurement. If you're off center, it'll skew all your imaging, stereo imaging, all that stuff. They also do the initial level settings off of that first measurement. And what ends up happening is, then from that first measurement, they take the levels, delays, and now they use the response, all the squiggles and the shape of the curve, and they now average that out over all the subsequent measurements you take. So with that, you basically want to give them an average so that if you lean down on your couch, if you lay back, if you sit forward, or even lay down, you have a bubble that keeps it from correcting for just everything at this one ear plane in the room. Because some of us here are, Dave sits at a much different ear height than I do. And with that, you're going to, we want, generally the measurements I take are at least height 6 to 12 inches up and down, left to right about the arm width of the chair. So the first measurement would be about where your nose would be, or back towards your head, depending on where your seat is. Sometimes you'll get a better result if you have recliners to recline them down so that there's not a reflector right behind your seat. But if you do that first one there, generally it'll go out to the shoulder or over the arm of the seat, the other arm, and then go forward, and then usually up. Sometimes another one down. And then that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can then still get the seat to your right, seat to your left if you feel generous to your friends, and maybe possibly another one out in 1 or 2 out in front. Depends on the system and how many you're doing. You'll see there's of the systems out there. The most prominent is Odyssey. Anthem has had a correction system called ARC, out for quite a while. One of the newest ones on the market that I've been a big fan of is Dirac. Dirac Room Correction first came out in some really expensive products. It then came out in some more as software and some more affordable bits. It actually originated in the automobile market, where they could correct for a fixed environment. So the environment didn't change, so they could fix it readily. They applied that into the home, and now there's products from the same company that makes the microphone, Mini DSP. They even make a 8-channel version that has 8 inputs, 8 outputs, and will correct those channels for $1,000, including a microphone. That technology that is in there is what we find in multi-$1,000 surround processors. And the ultimate key to Dirac over some of the others is that when you're done, you get a graphic of a curve, what it's correcting, and you can click and drag and drop and make season to taste exactly as you like, save a few settings, all those things. So you can do a lot more customization in that sense. Odyssey Pro actually allows a good bit of that customization. The trick there is that it does, when you make an edit, you have to have somebody with a pro kit, usually a calibrator. My advice when you ask if you go to hire an Odyssey calibrator, and they can be extremely worthwhile, the biggest thing to ask them is, do you measure the end result? And do you bring another microphone system like even the Mini DSP microphone is plenty accurate for calibrating most rooms. You can, some will say you need expensive gear, and if you want to do all at once 8 microphones around a room, that gets more expensive. The hardware that does that isn't as simple. But nowadays there's another system that Parts Express distributes that is a microphone, USB cable, software you load on your unit, a DVD that goes into your player, and you can take measurements. That whole system is $300. So when I started developing with my company, and that the equipment that would do these type of things was generally $2,000 and up. So we've come a long way of what's possible now. Some even get away with a Radio Shack meter and the Room EQ Wizard software, but what the microphones cost now, it's well worth it in the grand scheme of it. It's a couple movies worth to get a lot more from it. The best part with the microphone, once you have the microphone, if you get bored and and after a year you're finally hearing some things, I heard my buddy's system and mine doesn't do that. You can pull a microphone out and actually kind of take a look at what's going on and where you're really having troubles. And before you go buy a new product, see if there's room to improve stuff. Sometimes you can identify where the shortcomings are. And I need my subwoofer over there, but this subwoofer won't fit there. That's a valid reason to change. And sometimes you just see that, wait a second, the subwoofer that claims 14 or 12 hertz is really kind of dying off about 28 in your room. So there are some of those cases. So with that, the biggest thing to take away from all the room correction and setup systems is they work with what you give them. Give them a useful set of data points for what you're concerned with. There are cases where you're going to want to correct for multiple rows. Generally, before you do that, you want to make sure both those rows sound reasonably good. I've had cases where we have 2 rows in a theater and we have massive subwoofers in the room, and that second row is a few feet from the back wall. And the owner puts 3 measurements by the main seat, left, right seat, goes 1, 2, 3 across the back rows, goes and listens, and there's no bass in the main row. And that's because that back row, as you often hear, you go to back up against a wall, the bass starts booming and gets really strong. Well, it averaged that into all those measurements, and now it castrated your bass in the main row. So when you hear those types of things, that's where you don't say, oh, Odyssey sucks. No, it had bad data. And so redo the measurements, change what it is. You can basically sculpt a lot of what Odyssey and the other systems are doing by where you take your measurements. And that's one of the biggest aspects of running the calibration systems. Even the automated ones in the units can do well if you take some time with that, and be ready for the fact you may have to do it again. So. Real quick, as far as, once we get a room calibrated, and that go through very quickly some things as far as when you start considering upgrades. If you notice, we took the effort this year to bring in all of the drapes. And when we walked in here early on, this was, quite an echoey space. You wouldn't be as comfortable listening to me talk in here, for sure. And the speakers wouldn't have been anywhere near as happy. It'd be very slap echoey bright. We wouldn't hear any location from anything going on off the speakers. So everybody talks about it. No, everybody nods their head. Not a lot of people take the time to go look at the companies that are now offering room acoustics. It's not only RPG and ASC anymore. There are companies now like GIK, Real Traps, Vicoustic, and a few others that offer very affordable room treatments that are very effective. The number one takeaway on room treatments is that when you're starting out, anything under 3 inches thick, don't bother. And ultimately, the best treatment of a typical living space or a typical dedicated room before you get into the level of somebody mapping out everything and all the surfaces around is to put thick, soft treatment in the right places. And the thick treatment, the benefit there is the thickness determines how low in frequency it affects. If you've ever been into a room where somebody blanketed the walls with 1 to 2 inches of fiberglass and a bunch of fabric, or have, you know, curtains all over, you get a room that quickly kind of sounds like this, and very swimmy in the mid-bass, and male voices are really hard to distinguish in there. And you lose all the sparkle and life, and they'll say, oh, room treatments are bad, they take all the life out of the room. And what in fact happens is you've only treated the room, but you've only treated above 2 kilohertz. So you've only treated your tweeter. There's a whole lot more speaker there, a whole lot more sound through the system. And as we talked, you know, frequencies all have a wavelength. Tweeter frequencies are 1 inch long, and as you go down every octave it gets double, so you're talking, you know, feet as you get down below 500 hertz. And with that, basically the way these absorptive treatments work, the big you know, fabric wrapped panels you see on the wall, the point at the wall, the air isn't moving because it bounces and comes back. All the motion is out, and that point where you get the most air motion is a quarter wavelength from the wall. So you get a peak, middle, and out. So that quarter wavelength is where the air moves most. Because what happens then is at lower and lower frequencies, that quarter wavelength moves farther and farther from the wall. To get effective treatment, you need it to be far enough from the wall. It doesn't mean to be out at that quarter wavelength, but it's a percentage ratio where you need to get to that 3-inch range to be able to get down to, say, 500 hertz. And the best treatments when you're starting, especially on the front wall or the back wall, are if you can get the 5-inch, 8-inch deep stuff. And GIK is one of the few companies that actually makes traps like that. They also make corner traps that give you that. They do the same thing by doing making a triangle in the corner. Now your distance from the corner, while it goes this way, your distance here gets much thicker, and it controls that sound much better. So the treatments, you know, by far, the front wall behind the speakers is probably some of the, and around your center channel is actually one of the very important aspects. The sidewalls is up for debate if they're symmetrical and both reflective. You can't even leave them. And that side wall actually is what kind of gives a lot of the breath and the sound, like it goes out to the edges of the room. If it's too much, and if your speakers are too close, then it'll cloud the sound and things like that. When you're out this far, in many cases it actually is somewhat beneficial and doesn't have to be the first order of treatment. In many rooms, people will actually you'll see all the wacky shaped devices that are raised up panels and ridges that are called diffusers. And those are hard devices, and they will put those at the first reflection points. Is a very effective way to control the sound. But that first level of treatment, you can go to GIK Real Traps and all those companies, Acoustics. RPG will do the same for you too, just charge you 3 times as much. But they'll actually give you very solid recommendations, especially if you ask them, I want to make sure I do broadband treatment, I get down low. When you get to those 5 and 8-inch thick monster bass traps that they have, you're actually treating all the way down into 125 hertz range. And what that does is that's probably the most problematic area in all rooms out there. That's where the room correction has the most benefit, but still can't do enough without treatments helping a bit. So even bulky furniture, anything bulky, generally helps eat that up, and that's why you hear a big difference in a room going that way. That lower end is what actually gives a lot of the intelligibility, especially for, you know, the booming, you know, Morgan Freeman voices and things like that, to make it not just sound like a muddy mess, but get that clear intelligibility, which is a big thing we're going after in a home theater. And that's probably the biggest difference in the acoustics and the sound you're going for in between stereo music and a home theater, and listening even to your TV and everything else, is getting the dialogue clear. And so one of the demos that we use the most is animated scenes. And one of the reasons for that is that they usually have a good mix in places of, studio dialogue mixed right in with stuff exploding and all kind of, dragons crashing and planes, zooming overhead and things like that. So you get a good mix of that stuff all at once. But keeping that dialogue intelligibility is really the toughest thing and the biggest differentiator from that. A lot of speakers that will give the fun, deep imaging and all of those things won't be as intelligible when you go and put a movie in. And so when people do say, oh, it's good for this, good for that, it's not that you can't do both. It's that the things that are bigger problems in a home theater you can get away with on a two-channel system and vice versa. And finally, I'll wrap it up as, at the end, once you remember that whenever you make all these settings, you take a microphone, SPL meter, the room correction systems, all of them are only as smart as the person that wrote the program and the person who gave the input. Unfortunately, that's usually us. With that, they aren't infallible. Usually they will benefit greatly by sitting down listening and making adjustments. So after making getting everything set, don't be surprised if, wait, where's my bass? Or, oh my gosh, that came out ridiculously hot. It all depends on the system, what data it got, what's going on in your room. And don't be afraid to write down where you start or have a way to get back there, but then play around and listen. And you jump in the subwoofer range is the most common adjustment. You can easily hear a good 3 dB change quickly, and you can see whether more or less is what you want. And then from there, you can get down to about a 1 dB change that you're not hearing dramatic differences. But when you have an 80 hertz crossover on a speaker, sometimes you listen to a big, deep voice, you can actually hear how it changes the balance or clarity of that. Or how some explosion has this big wallop and shudder on it, and a couple dB more gives you that much more. So obviously we could go on a lot longer. You guys have had a long day. So I think we'll wrap it up there.